I'm Josh Schneiderweiler, coming up on Football Today.
And they plan to celebrate throughout the evening. And why not? They get fantastic crowds. They give their side wonderful support. And today, they have deservedly clinched promotion to the Premier League. And next season, it won't be Wigan who are coming calling. It'll be Chelsea and Manchester United.
In 2010, Brighton and Hove Albion were a small club playing home games for under 10,000 fans in England's third division. Now, the club is in its third consecutive season in the Premier League, hosting crowds of more than 30,000. What a difference a decade makes. Behind it all is owner Tony Bloom. And on today's episode, we speak with The Athletic's Brighton beat reporter, Andy Naylor, about Bloom's rise from professional bettor to Brighton savior. You recently wrote an in-depth profile on Brighton owner Tony Bloom for The Athletic. What was your motivation for writing that piece?
Well, I was aware from some time ago that his 50th birthday was on the horizon, which is quite a notable personal landmark. I think what it was an opportunity to go into some depth and tell our subscribers about this owner of Brighton and Hove Albion and why, in many respects, he is a little bit unique. The reason I say that is there are various elements, really, and I think we'll come on to some of them in a bit more depth maybe later. But the first is the family connection with the club, which has spanned something like half a century. So you've got that family connection. You've also got the fact that he has been an avid fan since he was 7-8 years of age and was first taken to a game. And you combine that with the fact that here is a guy, because of his business empire that he's created, that has the wealth to have transformed the club's fortunes. So you put all of those elements together and you think about that in the context of the Premier League as it is today. Lots of clubs, foreign ownership and investment, but perhaps not that historical affinity. And that makes Tony Bloom, I think, as I indicated, fairly unique.
I find it interesting that we actually don't know a whole lot about Bloom, considering his family has been a big presence in Brighton and Hove Albion's history for a long time. You mentioned about 50 years.
Yeah, that's because they are a private family in many respects. They engage in an awful lot within the local community, particularly the Jewish community and projects. But Tony doesn't naturally kind of seek publicity. You know, he just kind of gets on with things, fairly low profile. That's the way he likes it. Doesn't do a lot of media. So they are quite private in that respect, although they're well known locally.
So when did they first kind of become associated with the club? I think you mentioned in the piece it was his grandfather who got the family into the football business.
We have to go back quite a way, and to give it some context, we're talking about the 1970s here. Now, at that time, Tony's late grandfather, Harry, was vice chairman. And Alan Mullery mentions in the piece, he's now a club ambassador, that Harry was like a second father to him. Harry came to Brighton from the East End of London. He was a hotelier, a car dealer, and he liked a bit of gambling, which is kind of where it started for Tony. So Harry was the one who first took Tony to games at the Goldstone ground, Brighton's former home ground, when Tony was about 8 years of age. So that is where the kind of Bloom story started. You've also got on the Brighton board since 1984, Ray Bloom, who is the youngest of Harry's 4 sons. So that gives you an idea of the kind of extent to which the family has been involved over, like I say, we're talking half a century.
And did Tony play football when he was growing up?
It's interesting you say that. I spoke to one of his former headmasters. He went to a school called St Christopher's School in Hove. And it just so happens that my own children went to that school. And the headmaster there taught him geography. At that time, the school concentrated only on rugby. And He said that he thinks that was a bit of a disappointment for Tony that he couldn't play football. And he used to play on the wing, Tony, as a rugby player. Tony's quite small and was quite small at that age. And according to his former headmaster, he used to get crunched quite a lot. So I think he'd have liked the opportunity to have played football more himself in those early formative years.
It sounds kind of like a first love for him, though. Like that was the first thing that he really enjoyed a lot was football, and then, as you mentioned, gambling.
Yes, the kind of two intertwine because of Harry's interest in gambling. Tony used to go, he said, from a young age down on the slot machines, which are an area in Brighton called West Street. So from a young age, he used to go down there with friends. He used to be into that kind of environment of enjoying, on a very, very small scale, gambling. So I think, again, that kind of shows how much of an influence Harry was on him.
I want to fast forward a little bit. So it's the 1990s, and Bloom is working at the accountancy firm Ernst & Young. How does he end up getting into gambling?
Well, you've got to bear in mind that by that stage, so he's been to Manchester University. He's got a degree in mathematics because very much into numbers. He'd actually sort of become a professional gambler, if you like, himself at that stage for a few years. And he was approached, headhunted, if you like, by Victor Chandler, a large bookmakers.
I'm being joined by Victor Chandler, one of the legends of gambling, and also
he spent time working for them both in Thailand and Gibraltar. And that's when, and this becomes part of the Tony Bloom story, that's when he really first latched on to Asian betting. But I should perhaps mention one other thing about how he established a reputation early on in his time at Victor Chandler. So we're talking the 1998 World Cup in France. France reached the final against Brazil. He convinced the bosses at Victor Chandler that the money they had made, the profits they had made up to that stage of the tournament, should go on France in the final. That proved to be a very shrewd call because France won 3-0.
And Brazil struggling to get back. Vieira. Emmanuel Petit. 3! Made in Highbury. Finished in Paris. The World Cup belongs to France.
It's not known. There's no evidence of how much they profited from that. I think it's fair to assume it was a fairly sizable sum. So going back to the Asian betting, which is, like I say, a really key part of the Tony Bloom story. So he latched on very quickly to an early stage, certainly in terms of the UK, Asian betting and how that could work in England. What does Asian betting involve? If I can give an example, if Liverpool are playing Norwich, the team currently at the bottom of the table, now clearly Liverpool are going to be very strong favourites for that game. Norwich are going to be huge underdogs. The odds are going to reflect those two facts. So it doesn't, for most people, become a very attractive betting proposition because you're going to have to invest an awful lot of money for a small return on Liverpool, who you will expect to win, and the likelihood of Norwich winning is going to be reflected by those odds. So what the Asian system does is handicaps so that you, for example, give Norwich 2 goals. We're not starting at 0-0, we're starting with Norwich 2-0 up. That changes the complexion of the odds. That makes them more equitable. It becomes a more attractive betting proposition. And Tony recognised from an early stage, it was already popular in Asia, how popular that could also be in the UK.
And so at this point, he gets the nickname The Lizard.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, the Lizard comes more from his, because we're talking about one of his hobby, let's call it a hobby, poker. And when I say, I mean a very good poker player, as in world tour poker player.
I'm here with Tony Bloom, top British poker player and also the chairman of Brighton and Hove Albion Football Club. How's the main event started for you today?
It's been going for 3 hours. I've hardly picked up a hand, so I'm down to 25,000 from 30,000.
The Australasian champion in 2004, and that nickname derived from the fact he was said to have alligator blood when playing at the table.
So he's cold-blooded at the table.
That's the inference. As a friend actually said to us, lovely guy, but you wouldn't want to play him at poker.
So tell us about how he ends up starting Star Lizard, which in the piece you describe as his, quote, golden gaming chip. What does that company do?
Well, just to backtrack a bit, so after he leaves Victor Chandler to branch out on his own and he starts his own company, Premier Bet, who are primarily concentrating on the Asian betting market, sells that for around £1 million. And he starts up Star Lizard in 2006. Now, this is a company based in Camden in North London, and they are essentially expert betting advisors, sports betting advisors. So it's Tony's company, and he's also its biggest client because he's head of a US syndicate. So what you've got is a lot of very rich clients from all around the world, and they go into great depth, this is the company, in terms of the advice they offer. So just to give you an example on a football match, this can be everything from team news details, injuries, to how many supporters might be at the game, weather conditions, pitch conditions, really forensic detail they go into. So, it's not a betting company. They don't make bets themselves, but they are advising clients, as I say, worldwide.
So why do you think he was so successful as a professional poker player or as a bettor?
I think what you've got is a combination here. So he's interested in sport anyway, the football and sport. And as his headmaster pointed out from a very early age, it was clear that he was very strong on the maths. That was his specialist subject. That was clear from a very early time in his schooling. So what he's done is almost been able to combine those two, the data knowledge, the interest in data and how you can use that to your advantage. And he's applied that to sport.
So he sets up this company, Star Lizard, which is making millions and millions of pounds. And then in 2009, he buys Brighton from Dick Knight. How does that come about?
So they're struggling financially still. They're at this temporary ground in the lower divisions. They've had these plans for a new stadium, which have been ongoing. There's been a real fight to get that approved. It gets approved. Now, Tony, around this time, unbeknown to pretty much everybody, apart from a small number of people, has been essentially propping up the club financially. When the planning permission is given for the stadium, we're talking at a time here which unfortunately kind of coincided with the financial crash. It was pretty clear that Dick Knight was going to struggle to fund the project. Tony Bloom was able to do that and offered to do that. Now, we're talking here about a £93 million investment, a fairly substantial amount of money. So obviously in return, he wanted at that point to become chairman. It wasn't the most affable of takeovers, let's say. Dick's nose was put out of joint a bit. I think he felt that, having done the hard yards, considering where the club had been in his time, he proposed a sort of ceremonial handing over of the keys on the pitch for when Brighton eventually got to play their first game at the stadium. And he also suggested that Tony becomes vice chairman initially so that he can show him the ropes. Both of those elements, they're not really Tony's style. Dick was an advertising man. His background was in advertising. As I say, Tony quite private, analytical. So eventually an agreement, Tony repaid some of it was 400,000 of the 1.8 million that Dick Knight had invested in the club, and he became chairman. At which point Brighton had only just survived under their then manager Russell Slade We're talking 8, 9, and they just survived relegation, which saved them from dropping back into the bottom tier of English football. So that's the context. That's where Brighton were at the point that Tony Bloom became chairman.
As we just outlined, they were in League One when Bloom took over, and now they're in the Premier League. So just how has he changed the club?
I guess you've got to look 2 elements to it. The infrastructure side of it, which has obviously been massive, and that's meant massive investment. I've mentioned there the stadium. So you now have the Amex Stadium, which is a ground equipped for Premier League football. There's also a training complex. Their training complex is I live in a place called Shoreham, and I can actually just about see it out of my back garden. It's behind me as we speak. It's at a place called Lancing, about 8 miles west of Brighton. This is a top facility, among the best in the country. Has pretty much everything you could ask for, and they're still developing it now with more funding from Tony. They're in the middle of further development, which will create a women's hub, a training ground. He's built up the infrastructure to a place where they're equipped to a very high level. On the pitch, well, it's become a question of making good decisions, key decisions in terms of managers. I think I mentioned there Russell Slade, and Russell was aware Tony was always going to want to bring in his own man at that stage, and he did. He appointed Gus Poyet, which was quite a left field appointment. If you actually look at the managers Tony's appointed in his time as chairman, I think it's quite interesting that the majority have been kind of forward thinking, which is the way Tony is. He tends to look at the bigger picture, and perhaps appointments that when these lists come out, when you see a manager's gone and a job is up, you get a whole load of names thrown in from bookmakers and stuff. And quite often with Brighton, they've not been obvious candidates. There was Gus Poyet, Oscar Garcia, who was there for a season, former Barcelona player, Sami Hyypiä, former Liverpool legend, which was the one appointment under Tony that didn't work, was short-lived. Chris Hughton, who in his 4.5 years did an unbelievable job. Chris, funny enough, was the exception to that picture I'm painting. He took over at a time when they were in trouble under Sammy in the Championship, the second tier, right towards the bottom in relegation trouble. And so Chris was a different kind of choice, a more, if you like, more obvious pick at that stage. And he took them up, kept them up for 2 seasons, and now we have Graham Potter. Again, you know, a guy who did fantastic work at Östersunds in Sweden, 1 season in the Championship at Swansea after they'd just been relegated from the Premier League and were dealing with the cash constraints that entailed. And he was appointed in May. And also beyond that, on the other side, Chief Executive Paul Barber, sort of stellar CV, worked for the FA, worked for Spurs, MLS Vancouver Whitecaps, and now they have as technical director Dan Ashworth, who had the same job title for the FA, did a lot of successful work with England. So I think he's made some high quality appointments in key areas.
He strikes me as a very hands-on owner based on kind of what you're saying.
It's interesting. The best way, I think, to describe the way Tony runs things is he's a collaborator rather than a dictator. So there's no doubt that when it comes to the big decisions, be that changing the manager, and we had a good example of that at the end of last season when he decided to sack Chris Hughton, Tony makes those decisions. He's the one. He's the one who delivers those decisions in person as well. But he doesn't make them in isolation. He does have people around him whose views he respects and trusts, and he will talk those things through with them. So it's not just a case of him going off by himself. He thinks them through and, as I said, speaks to a close associates whose opinions he values.
You've been a beat reporter in Brighton for a long time now. Have you spoken with him personally? Have you interacted with him before?
Yeah, absolutely. Over the course of, wow, I've been covering the club for over 30 years. In that time, I can remember 2 occasions that stick in my mind with Tony, just little things. I can remember, and we're going back to the days when they were in the lower divisions. Nobody really knew of his involvement, and I was standing on a railway station platform at Hartlepool, which is a small club in the northeast of England. It's a one-track platform. It was after the game. There were maybe 150 Brighton supporters on the platform. Tony was at one end of the platform, just very kind of normal-looking guy. And I remember thinking to myself, because this was at the stage when I was aware that he was putting money in, but it wasn't public knowledge, that these fans have got no idea how significant this guy is and could go on to be in the future of the football club. He travels by train to a lot of games, to most games. I can remember bumping into him once on the train, I think with his brother Darren, and we had a good chat on the journey. He does that a lot with supporters. Supporters see him.
I love you, Tony.
We all love you, Tony.
Thank Tony, we all marry me. Marry me, Tony. Tony. We do. We love you, Tony. We do. Oh, Tony, we love you. We love you, Tony.
On trains, he engages with them. That's not necessarily what you would expect, the mode of transport you would necessarily expect of the type of owner we're talking about with his kind of wealth. But that's how Tony is. He doesn't do a lot of media, as I said. I haven't got to know him closely over that time because I think there are very few people who do know Tony really well. And that was part of the challenge with the piece, is to speak to those people. But yeah, I've always found him very polite and good company.
We've kind of alluded to that, he's a very successful guy, seemingly very smart on the outside, and he's still only 50 years old. How far do you think he can take Brighton?
Well, it's interesting because, as I alluded to earlier, he's always thinking ahead, kind of long-term. There's a lot of long-term strategy in what he does. So their long-term vision, which the board agreed to, it was kind of prompted by Paul Barber, the chief executive who I referred to earlier, was to establish Brighton as a top 10 club in the long term. So that is their goal. Now, they are very much aware of the fact to reach that end game, there are going to be some bumps along the way. And those bumps may just include not being in the Premier League anymore. The threat of relegation. Who knows what's going to happen with the rest of the season with the coronavirus situation. But, as we speak, they are involved with 5 other clubs in a relegation fight. But they have this longer term goal where they are not one of the clubs that are always looking over their shoulders at trying to stay out of the bottom 3. And so there's a lot of long-term planning. I mentioned the appointment of Dan Ashworth, the academy and bringing their own players through, and they're getting pretty good at that. We've seen 2 of them used this season by Graham Potter, Stephen Alzati and Aaron Connolly. So that is their long-term vision. And dare I say, when you look at what Tony's achieved, both with the club and in his business empire, you'd be a pretty brave man to actually bet against him getting there.
You can follow all of Andy Naylor's coverage of Brighton and Hove Albion on The Athletic. This episode was produced by Hugo Chambray and John McKenzie. I'm Josh Schneider-Weiler, and thanks for listening. And if you enjoyed the show, please rate and review us on iTunes and share it with a friend.